Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today's book reading is actually the first chapter of my urban fantasy mystery, Obsidian Murders, and the title series is The Midnight Detective Agency. I will be reading the first chapter and I hope you enjoy. And if you are interested in reading the book, all of that information is going to be pinned and in the description box below. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Bethesda, Maryland. I drummed my fingers against the side of the desk, trying to keep my eyes off the office fairy that was dragging a set of keys under the chair, pisting at me to get my attention. I sucked in a deep breath and plastered a fake, toothy grin across my face as Rebecca Anderson, my boss, breezed past me and sat in her high-backed chair with a smile. This was my second performance review at the Bethesda newspaper, but I wasn't nervous. I'm good at my administrative assistant job, even though it sucks. Tedious, boring, and it didn't take up a lot of brain power. I often finished work early and had to pretend I had another 2 hours worth of work to do. The job was so easy I couldn't complain, except for two minor details, one of which was Drusille, the office fairy who expected nothing less than perfect cleanliness, which I usually agree with if you're working in an office building with horrible ventilation and sweaty bodies, but not now. His hissing and pouting had to end. Bethesda, Maryland was once a small city for anyone that didn't want to live in Washington, D.C., but had no issue commuting until a sudden burst of wealth drew flocks of people to work in and around the metropolitan area. That included me. Now, 12 years later, the small city's population was pushing triple digits. The people who'd flocked to the city were rich, minus a few concessions. I was one of those concessions. I graduated a year ago with a BA in journalism from Salem State University and barely earned enough to make rent each month, which is minor detail number 2. I had a journalism degree working for a local newspaper in an ever-growing city, but I could only manage an administrative job because of my lack of experience. Or so Rebecca explained when she hired me a year ago. That had to be different since it'd been a year, right? Right. To give her some credit, she doesn't own the newspaper, but she could give me a few extra pieces. I was able to write 7 articles about small businesses opening, and I interviewed a local skateboarding club that met on the weekends that picked up trash around the city, but that's not enough for me. So my smile grew wider and I nodded reverently as Rebecca rattled off the usual, "You're doing so well, and we love your writing," while ignoring the fairy who was untying my shoelaces. It didn't do nothing for me professionally or personally to deal with the fairy in question in front of my boss. I learned as a child that whenever I said I could see other beings, or as the vast majority of the population would say, mythical creatures, I'd be deemed crazy. And I had been, in fact, deemed crazy by numerous teachers in elementary school. I was shunned, bullied, and harassed. They even made me see a therapist twice a week for hallucinations before my parents moved to Salem, Massachusetts when I was 13 years old. It was a learning experience, to say the least. After that, I never told another soul about my magical ability aside from several local Salem covens. I started to bop my foot, trying to rid myself of the fairy, but he grabbed hold of the flaps of my black high-top Converse and held on as if he were at a Texas rodeo. "So, what do you think?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward with interest. I blushed, realizing I hadn't been paying attention. I cleared my throat before asking, just before I agreed, "Can you explain it to me again?" Rebecca rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair. "I want you to take over the advice and gossip column for Jolene. The questions related to online dating and ghosting, whatever that means, frustrates and confuses her, and she has no idea about the latest Hollywood gossip. Also because she's retiring in 2 months and you have found no one to replace her." "Yes, that too. But it works out, doesn't it? You get a $5,000 raise, 2 weeks paid vacation, and a 401k, Rebecca explained with a little too much excitement. I shifted in my seat. A $5,000 raise and the added benefits would help immensely, but it wasn't a legitimate journalism job like we talked about a few weeks ago. I didn't spend thousands of dollars on a journalism degree to run an advice and gossip column, Rebecca. I told you during my original job interview I want to be a full-time journalist. I knew from the start that I had to work up to it, and honestly, I'd rather do that than run a gossip and advice column. Rebecca waved away my concerns. You think someone fresh out of college would be this lucky? Anyone your age would jump at this opportunity. All my friends have actual journalism jobs. Do they live with 5 other people in a 1-bedroom apartment and can only afford wax-coated ramen noodles? Rebecca countered. Well, yes, but they're doing what they love and, please, not this again. Rebecca pressed her fingers against her temples and shook her head. I came to you first because I didn't want to go through the process of hiring someone from scratch when I have you, a fantastic writer with a heart and empathy, and someone young enough that knows what ghosty means, I added. Rebecca glared at me. Yes, indeed. She paused for a moment, her fingers running across her keyboard. I knew she was about to say something important, but a staffer knocked on the office door before Rebecca could speak. Stay here, we aren't done yet, Rebecca said before she scurried out the door. When my boss and the staffer were out of sight, I gritted my teeth, swung my head under the desk, and plucked the fairy from my shoe. He squirmed in my grasp and squeaked in fake terror. I rolled my eyes so far back into my head I saw Jesus and plopped the fairy down onto my lap. What is your problem now, Drusilla? Drusilla puffed up his chest. Lucinda keeps leaving trash under her desk and refuses to clean it up. Do you know how revolting it smells under there? And taking her keys will do what? I asked, already knowing the answer. House fairies, or office fairies if they're in an office setting, would steal items and hide them to teach humans a lesson. But unless you knew about fairies, there was no lesson learned. She needs to learn how to clean up after herself. We've had this discussion, Drusilla. How will anyone in this building know they're being punished when you hide something from them? They can't see you. Only I can. Why can't you say something for me then? Please? Drusilla asked meekly, his cheeks burning red. Why don't you tell Lucinda? I bet she'll be ecstatic to see a house fairy randomly appear before her and go off about her organizational problems. I don't like your tone, Drusilla muttered. His eyes were flashing from hazel to black as he growled at me in frustration. I poked his beer belly. He screeched and wrapped his arms around his torso, trying to protect his stomach from another poke, but his eyes went back to his normal hazel color and his cheeks deflated. That was just plain rude, Tessa O'Hara, Drusilla sputtered. When you bother me during a meeting with my boss, who can fire me at any time, yes, I'm going to be a bit rude. Please, put Lucinda's keys where you found them and find another way to get her to clean up after herself. Drusilla grumbled under his breath but nodded. I held out my hand and he scooted out of my palm, still muttering under his breath. But with all his huffing, Drusilla immediately went to haul Lucinda's keys back from whence they came now that his tantrum was over. And it was just in time. Rebecca opened her office door and closed it a moment later with a sharp slam. She winced and apologized for the noise. I nodded and sighed with relief, thankful it wasn't a passive-aggressive outburst on Rebecca's part. Rebecca smoothed her skirt under her before sitting back down. Where were we? I was going to ask if you'd be interested in writing the story about the 4 high schoolers who were involved in a hit and run that I wrote up 3 weeks ago, I stated, heart hammering against my ribcage. Rebecca didn't want to run the story because the 4 high schoolers in question were the sons of diplomats who were keen on keeping the story quiet, even though the crash sent 5 people to the hospital. But I had one last chance to push for the story to be printed in the next publication. Rebecca groaned in protest before she face-palmed and my heart fell, but I refused to show defeat or embarrassment. Instead, I shrugged, lip curling in artificial amusement. You know I had to try. And you know I can't do that. The owner of the newspaper is close with one of the diplomats, Rebecca explained in exasperation. Back to the original question, Tessa. Do you want the job or not? I need an answer. I bit the inside of my cheek, the smile falling into a grimace. I needed the money and the benefits. But would this set back my career? I could already picture it in 30 years, still answering people's silly and often creepy questions for the Bethesda newspaper advice column, not to mention the gossip section would probably suck my soul dry. I was a journalist, not an advice and gossip columnist. I didn't want to sell myself short and be stuck for the rest of my life doing something I never would have chosen to do if not for financial issues. But on the other hand, in this economy, choosers were losers, and I rather enjoyed having a roof over my head. And food. Definitely food. Yes, I'll take the job for now. I held out my hand for a handshake, which was met with a sigh of relief and slight annoyance. Thank you for joining me in my reading of the first chapter of Obsidian Murders. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!